This is Gerald Vance with the Appalachian Heritage Woodshop. I'm going to talk to you about how to secure a tabletop to a base. There's three methods I'm going to show here today. The main thing is you have to allow for expansion and contraction, and of course it has to be able to support the weight of the top and the base. So let's go over the three different types. We have a wood button, and I'll go into depth in that in just a little bit. And we have a figure 8 here and a Z-clip here. Now let's look at the Z-clip first. If you notice on this Z-clip, it's a piece of metal shaped in a Z. That's why it's called that. In the manufacturing process, right here is a little bit of extra metal, and that is put there to reinforce this angle. There is none on this angle right here. So this angle is not reinforced. If it had that metal reinforcing, it would be on the bottom side, and that would prohibit your movement getting the maximum length of your tenon or your tongue. Now, because it doesn't have that, this angle can deflect, or this piece of metal, this tongue, can bend. And I've seen that happen when it's used and it cannot support the amount of weight. It will bend and flex, and then your top will not be held tight to the apron. So that's the first thing. Now the way this works is, of course, it screws into the table, and then you have a slot or a groove that the tongue fits into. Now if you look right here, I've marked, there's the maximum and there's the minimum. So that is the amount of movement this Z-clip allows for. And it is about 3/8 of an inch, 7/16 to 3/8 of an inch. So I would not feel safe using this if I calculated the tabletop to move more than 1/4 of an inch. It would not suffice. So that's the Z-clip. Now let's look at the figure 8. This is the figure 8, and it's called a figure 8. I'll show you in a minute when I turn this over and take it off, you'll see. It's shaped like a figure 8, and it moves, it pivots on a screw, and it moves in an arc, and it's very important, okay? But it's moving this direction. If you notice the grain of the wood, the expansion and contraction for this piece is going to be this direction. So this will not move in or out. So it has no movement in the direction that the wood is going to expand. So that means the figure 8 can only be used on the side and not on the front or back of a table. That's very important. Now the other thing I wanted to show you was how it moves in an arc. So let me take this off real quick. Now when I turn this over, you can see there is a recessed flat bottom hole that the figure 8 fits into and screws into that, and you can see it just pivots back and forth. Now here you can see the arc that it travels on. The distance between the maximum points is just under 1/2 inch, but in reality it will not move that much. Because it is moving in an arc, it'll bind before it gets to the far point on the arc on each side. So it's going to move less than that. Now I'm going to say less than 3/8. So again, the figure 8 and the Z-clip have very limited movement. Okay? So now let's look at a wood button. Now a wood button, it is custom made. And what you have is you have a tongue or a tenon. You have the overall body. You have the heel, the toe, sides, and then this would be the top and the bottom. So the wood button is made for the task at hand. So if you have a very small table, you can make a very small wood button. If you have a larger table, then you can make a larger wood button. So it's sized for a specific task. In order for a wood button to work properly, there are 7 issues which you need to address to ensure that the button performs the task it is designed to perform. So I've gone over the parts of the wood button. Now let's look at the 7 issues which you have to address in order to have a successful wood button. Okay, the first one is grain direction. If you notice on all of these, the grain is running this direction. If you had grain running this way, then you would create a weak point right along the base of the tongue or tenon and where the screw is. And over time, that could break, crack, and not hold. So the grain direction is very important. It always goes lengthways. That's the first thing. The second issue is the length of the tenon or the tongue. It has to be sized to address the amount of movement the top is going to move. So you need to calculate how much movement you're going to have, and you need to make your tongue slightly longer than the maximum wood movement. And I usually make mine about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch longer than the maximum calculated wood movement. Okay. Now, along with the length of the tenon is the depth of the mortise. Now, here is the mortise that the wood button fits in when it secures to the tabletop. Now, what I want to show you is, if you look right here, you can see the depth is about a 1/16 of an inch more than the length of the tongue. That's so it will not bind. So that's critical. So the length of the tongue and the depth of the mortise have to be sized to allow for the expansion and contraction. The third thing you need to be aware of is the thickness of the tenon or the tongue. It has to be able to support the weight. So if you notice here, we have one that is very, very thin. It was made to support a very lightweight, delicate table. And this one is sized to support a more robust, heavy table. So the thickness of the tenon or the tongue has to be able to support the weight. And also, the thickness of your groove has to match the tenon, and I like for it to be just maybe a 1/16 of an inch wider. But more importantly, the distance from the tabletop down to your groove, or this much wood, this much meat, has to be able to support the weight of the tabletop. Okay? So, that's another issue you have to look at. Then, the thickness of the body. The thickness of the body, especially where the screw is, has to be able to support the weight of the tabletop. And when you put a screw through there, you're putting a lot of weight on a small area. So if it is too thin, the screw can just pop right through. So it's got to be thick enough to support that. The width of the body is an issue which is important. If it is very, very narrow, it cannot support a lot of weight. The wider it is, the better it is when it comes to weight. If you have a narrow one with a lot of weight, you're putting a lot of pressure on a very small amount of area, and you're going to end up crushing the fibers, and then you're going to end up creating a gap. So I usually make mine about 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches wide. But again, it needs to be sized for the task that you are asking it to perform. Okay, the last critical issue on the size of the button is the placement of the button and the number of the buttons. Now by that I mean I like to place the buttons close to the corners and then space them along the length and the width based on the weight and size of the tabletop. The more buttons you have, the more secure it's going to be. the less buttons, then the more weight you are putting on each button. So that's very important. Also, the button, if you noticed, it fit into this groove. I need to show you this is very, very critical. When it is in there and tight, I call it a thumbnail test. You need to take your thumbnail and go along the top, and your thumbnail needs to catch on a little bit of an apron right there. In other words, there is about a 32nd of an inch of gap between the button and the tabletop. And the reason for that is when you put that in there and put your screw in, it pulls it down, it actually wedges it in place and tightens it, and that will pull the top down. If it is the exact same thickness or flush, it will not always pull it down. Okay? And don't worry, that will still allow for movement. The last issue that you need to address is the size of the screw. Now obviously the length of the screw is critical because when you put it in, you don't want the point of the screw to protrude up through the top of your tabletop. So the length is critical, but also the size. These two screws are the same length. This is a 14 and this is an 8. If you're using a very heavy, robust tabletop and a large button, then you need to use a large screw. If you're using a very small, delicate one, then you can use a screw even smaller than this. Make certain that you use a screw that is designed for wood. Don't use a drywall screw. Okay, so that's the 7 criteria to ensure your wood button is sized properly to hold the tabletop to the base. Now, if you design it properly, it will work as it is designed to work. In other words, it will perform the task it is designed to perform. It doesn't cost anything to make a wood button. These are made out of scrap wood. I prefer to make mine out of the scrap that's left over from the project I'm working on. In other words, the same species of wood. Some people like to use a contrasting wood. You know, it's a matter of personal preference. I do recommend hardwood. And the last thing is, because they are custom made, you need to calculate the amount of expansion and contraction and make your wood button based on that. So it is sized properly. It is not pre-manufactured like these that have a limited range. You make them to fit the range movement you need. And I recommend that you use the wood button and remember these 7 criteria to ensure your wood button is sized properly. This is Gerald Vance with the Appalachian Heritage Wood Shop reminding you, be proud of your Appalachian heritage.